Hi everyone, my name is Esmeralda. I am your podcast host for A Flourishing Start. Caring for young children is a meaningful and rewarding experience. It's also hard. Society created an unfair expectation for parents and guardians to carry, and that is raising perfect, happy, and healthy children, often without access to outside support. In this episode, you will hear the stories of the challenges that we as parents and families go through as we work hard to navigate our children's well-being as well as our own. We believe burdens can be alleviated, but it will take courage from our leaders to uplift our stories and take action with urgency through policy. Here with me today, I have Eva Rivera and Angela, as well as Edith. Welcome to the podcast. Edith is a mother of 2 young children. In order to find her young child mental health support post-COVID-19, Edith navigated the education system, insurance policies, and much more. Edith professionally works with marginalized communities with a special focus on housing and mental health services. Today, we are also joined by Eva Rivera. She is a policy director at the Children's Partnership, where she develops and leads the execution of the Children's Partnership's policy and advocacy agenda, specifically focused on early childhood development. Last but not least, we are joined by Angela, the policy director at the Children's Partnership, where she leads the development and execution of policy and advocacy, specifically focusing on mental health and child well-being. So mental health looks different in every child and at every age. And today I wanted to talk about, specifically like for myself in my personal life too. I had a very tragic event happen in my life when I was 10, but it happened to my family. My older brother, Hernan, when he was 18, passed away due to gun violence. And I had a younger brother who was 5 years old at the time. And I wished that there was more support or a more touch point with my family to share what the importance was of looking after us as a unit after this event. But also, they kind of shunned away my younger brother. They're more like, he's not going to really remember anything, so let's just kind of leave him behind in a way. That's what it felt like. And so I feel that this is not something that is unique. I think a lot of families end up getting left behind, and including the youngest children because they're the youngest. And so I wanted to just kind of set the frame of every mental health is going to look different in every child and at every age. And so let's just start talking about that in the context of our families. Edith, thank you for joining us today. I was moved by your experience that you shared about navigating your child's well-being. Would you be able to share your story with us?
Yeah, absolutely. My story for this specific issue starts with my daughter after COVID. And we all knew it was going to affect children in some way, right? I just didn't expect it to affect it the way it did for my family. And I think that I thought if I ever went through that with my own children, that I would be completely prepared to handle it because I was a mental health worker and I had the connections and whatever. So my daughter started in about 2021, I would say April of 2021. She was nine at the time. She started having some severe anxiety, like separation anxiety, and it came out of nowhere. I mean, it almost happened like overnight. It was, I couldn't go to the bathroom without telling her. I couldn't, walk outside to get the mail without her having a complete panic attack. I couldn't go to work some days because she just didn't want to be alone. And it was really hard because I had this completely normal, happy, 8-year-old, and I get kind of emotional, so sorry. And it went from like that to a child who needed her mom all the time. And in the world that we live in, right? I'm a full-time mom. My husband was a full-time employee. At that time, he was actually working out of town. It was really, really hard. So besides the emotional part and the struggle of me being a parent, I found it really difficult to navigate services for her. Originally, I went through the school, right? And they were like, go through the school. They have social workers. They have somebody to help you. So I started there. And they were like, oh, well, we're overwhelmed. We don't have a lot of social workers. We'll get in touch with you as soon as we have one. We'll give you a call next week. And the next week came and this went on for months. Like I couldn't get anybody. At the same time, I was trying to navigate finding her one through her insurance provider. I mean, we have private insurance. So I was like, shouldn't be so difficult. But that was impossible during COVID. And even after, I feel like now. Couldn't find someone under our insurance, kept making appointments and people were like, we're not taking any clients. I'm sorry. So it was so difficult, right? And then, there was the COVID restrictions that made it even more hard. So she went on about for 7 months like that. And it just progressively got so bad. I mean, where she was having panic attacks at night every day. And so I called my boss one day and I was like, look, like, I don't know what to do. Like I've tried all the avenues that we're telling our clients to do, right? I've tried all those. And I can't seem to find help for her. And so she told me, it took her to tell me that I could contact my insurance provider and tell them, look, I've exhausted all of the avenues. I give them proof of all the times that you've contacted people, dates, whatever. And then they'll be able to do like an out of network access provider. And you'll have to pay out of pocket, but then they'll reimburse you. And I'm like, that was great. That was a great resource. It worked. I got my daughter into therapy, but we're paying $150 every time, once a week to get my daughter there. I'm in a blessed position that I could do that. But I kept thinking to myself, and my husband, when we had these candid conversations at night, we're like, we're blessed enough to do that, but not every family is. Who has $150 to just, throw away when you have insurance, and you're paying insurance? And that was really tough. And so that was really where I was like, this has got to change. Like, it's sad that our children don't have access readily available within their school system. I mean, they spend, most of their day there. And that was really tough. And so that was my experience with my daughter. Thankfully, now we're in 2023. She's doing great. There's, times when she has a little bit of setbacks, but nothing to where we were at in 2021. And I'm just so thankful that I had people to navigate the system with me and that I had a little bit of knowledge based on my career, my work. But I feel for everybody else that doesn't have that knowledge or that have language barriers or that, come from communities where resources aren't readily available. So that's my fight. I'm making that my fight moving forward, right? Early access prevention, so that these kids can become healthy adults and thrive in the world. So that was my experience. Mm-hmm.
One thing I wanted to also share is Eva and Angela, always feel free to come off mic and also contribute to the storylines that we're hearing. And Edith, I also want to honor your emotions that you shared with us too, because it also shows to me like how deeply it impacted you as a mother, seeing your child go through this. Is there something that you did to take care of yourself as you were navigating your child's well-being? Like, how was your well-being being affected at that time or even now afterwards that you kind of seen this journey that your daughter went through?
Yeah, I mean, I think there was a lot of mom guilt. One of the things that I guess I didn't mention is that I think what may have triggered it, or at least I blamed myself, and I thought this is what triggered it, was that my grandmother had passed away and I went to Mexico to the funeral. And I had to leave the children behind because it was COVID and flights were expensive and it was like a quick trip. And I said, there's no point for them to go. So it almost felt like me leaving triggered her separation anxiety. And and I think it was like they passed from COVID symptoms and all of these things. She's hearing all of these things, and somebody's like died. And even though she didn't know my grandparents like that, I think that it definitely set her in her head. She's making this thing a bigger deal than it was, right? And I think that that's what triggered it. So I felt a lot of guilt, right? I felt parent guilt for leaving her. Like, why did I leave her? If I hadn't left, this wouldn't happen. But I think that I, throughout the time, I'm gonna be really honest, I did not take time for me because I was too concerned to get her help. I was just like in like action mode, right? Like I was in fight or flight mode. I didn't ever stop to think like, oh, it's affecting me until after, until after I had gotten her help. So yeah, I've got to be honest. I didn't. I was just worried about her. Yeah.
I think that's a really important point to emphasize, that I think when parents go through a crisis, a hard sort of a hard family stressor, I think it's very easy. Our culture really emphasizes how resilient young kids are. I think maybe as a way to get parents to focus on work and labor and, don't worry about the kids, they're fine. And I think to some degree, yes, that's true. And I think we're learning now, again, especially with the brain science, that like kids are absorbing everything. Like it's not just the direct interactions that you have with your child. They are absorbing everything that they are hearing, the news, they are hearing our conversations, and they don't have the context or the language to understand what is going on. And so they make up stories in their heads about what is going on to help them make sense of things that are otherwise too big or too complicated for their little brains to process. And I think it's really easy to forget that process is very natural, that like that is what the child's brain is supposed to be doing. It is absorbing and learning and integrating everything that they are, experiencing around them. And I think that also means that parents need a lot more support before their child is, in crisis or trying to process something super big, so that there's that relationship, to notice when your kid maybe is seeming off, or that that things are sort of chaotic at home, and parents can sort of take a beat, pause, and make sure to help that child sort of integrate whatever is happening in that moment, that they're observing but maybe not directly engaging with. I think this story is really highlighting for me the importance of prevention, and helping parents support their child, so that when the big things happen, life happens, that they're not, that's not the first time they're sort of helping their child integrate experiences and their world around them.
Yeah, I agree. Absolutely.
And that brings me to Eva. Eva, why is it important to think of the family unit as a whole when talking about young children?
So, Edith, first of all, thank you for sharing your story with us. And have we met before? Because I feel like 2021, I mean, in general, 2021 was just a train wreck. 2020, all of this. And there were so many parallels in your story to my lived experience. And to your point about like how are parents taking care of ourselves during this during these moments, right? Like when life happens to all of us and our kids, and we talked a little bit earlier, I think, Angela, you were just saying children are absorbing everything, right? That is their job. And honestly, even as adults, right? Like we're literally we are processing things all the time. And so one thing I like to tell any adult working with kids when we have these like super high expectations of them, like at 3, you know, I'm like, they've been in this world for 3 years and they're just trying to figure it out. How long have you been here? And you have those days too, right? So let's put that in context. And so if we think about how difficult it can be for us as adults to process some of the things that we are experiencing and seeing and living in this world day to day, why isn't it important for us to be okay, right? Like if we need to be that model, we need to model how to interact, how to engage, how to process these really challenging things. And so if we're not equipped with those tools, if we don't have those resources, how can we and then transfer that and show that to our littles, right? How can we model like, hey, you know, this is hard, but it's okay. We're going to get through it. We're going to figure it out, right? Like, as you were talking, Angela, I was reminded of like this age-old saying of like kids should be seen and not heard, right? That is like how many of us have heard that and still hear that to this day, right? Like that mentality still exists. Well, guess what? Kids are in this world, and they are in this world from the moment they are born, and they are wired for learning. They are wired for connection. They are looking for that from the moment they enter this world. And so it is extremely important for families, whoever those caregivers, right? Whoever those adults that are going to be in those little people's lives, it is critical for them to be okay. And like we mentioned, we are the first people to not be even put on the list. Like caregivers are never on the list when it comes to taking care of littles, because our job is to take care of them, right? And so when it's a critical moment, like Edith talked about, we're just thinking about survival, right? Like, is my kid going to be alive tomorrow? Because when a parent is in the throes of it, and I can speak from personal experience, when I was in it, all I wanted, like, that was my question. Is my kid going to be here tomorrow? And that is what my job was in that moment when we were in the thick of it, was what do I need to do today to make sure that tomorrow looks okay for her? And I didn't care about, you know, what I needed to do. I mean, thankfully, I think at the time, well, I wasn't in therapy at the time. So, you know, it was just the village, like who was helping help us through this tough time. But you're right, Edith, not everybody has that. And so community is a huge part of our healing as well. And so I want to recognize that, you know, it's not, yes, it's the professionals for sure. Like that needs to be elevated, and the need for professionals who are accessible, who look like us, who speak our language, who can relate to our experiences is extremely important, because we don't want to walk into a situation where we're talking about what dinner looks like in our family and someone looks at us like we're crazy, right? Like that's not okay. That's not going to help us heal. So all that to say, providers are really important. I too am in this space because I lived with families, working with them directly, and thought, you know, I got to get to the policy level because we're not doing enough. So it's interesting that we're all here. It kind of, you know, we all got here in that similar way, right? Because we've seen how it doesn't work in practice, in theory, for the families. And so we, as adults, need to be okay. We need to have interventions for us, because we know that, you know, kids don't come to the doctor alone, right? Like there's a whole push for dyadic care here in our state of California. And it's because we know kids come to the doctor with adults, and adults are more likely to take their children to the doctor before they take themselves to the doctor. And so if we could intervene in those moments when we have them together, right? Hey, I see your little is struggling. How are you doing? What can we do for you too, so that you both can be together in this space and heal together? Like, what an amazing experience that could be for littles, right? To see their families be healthy and walk alongside with them in this journey as well. Like, wow, that's what I hope and wish can happen. So, yeah.
Yeah, that reminds me too of, like, for me personally, what happened to my family happened to us as a family unit. And I've always craved some sort of family healing. We've all tried to deal with it on our own, like therapy. I actually don't even know what my mother did to try to heal herself. It's even a touchy subject as a daughter to talk to a parent around that stuff. And so, like, I want to get in this conversation also of, like, what is policy? And Angela, I know you're very excited to uplift children in the way that is good for us and that looks like going into policy. And I was hoping you can start off with just explaining like, what is policy in general?
Yeah. So policy is really the structures, the systems, the things that the tools and the systems that our governments, our institutions, our organizations use to provide services, to create systems for us to live, work, and play in. And policy guides behavior on sort of a very macro high level. And if you sort of think about human behavior in sort of like concentric circles, you have individual behavior. If you go out a little bit more, you have family and community and how people are interacting with each other. And then sort of the next bigger circle, I would say, are systems and policies, right? How communities interact with each other, how communities interact with their government, how communities access resources, how communities engage in politics and their civic life by voting, by organizing, by protesting. And so policy influences all three of those circles in different ways. And that's really why I became a policy advocate. So I am a social worker by training, and it became very clear to me, even in graduate school. During my internship, I worked in a group home in South LA. It was one level below a locked facility. So these, young women had a lot of needs and had a lot of unmet needs and had a lot of trauma that not just they came with from their families of origin, but like trauma in the system, like the child welfare foster care system harmed these and was continuing to harm these young women that I was trying to work with and like basically do therapy and case management with. And very quickly I realized like, oh, this is like their issues are their issues, but also like I can do all the therapy I want with them and maybe help them in their journey to healing in this moment in time. But, the moment they leave, there's another kid, there's another young person coming right behind them with the same set of issues and the same systemic trauma. And so it was really that experience that made me go, I've got to think bigger about the issues at play here, about family trauma, about systemic oppression, about racism, and how our policies can both perpetuate these kinds of harms, but also there's an opportunity for healing policy. And that's really where I find a lot of my energy as an advocate, is not just getting rid of terrible policies or policies that are racist or harmful, but also like, are there policies that we can advocate for that actually help bring, young people together with their caregivers, with their peers, with their communities and their culture? What are healing policies? How can we shift our systems and institutions to support healing and well-being, and not just really have policies that serve people who already have power and privilege, namely, white men in this country in particular.
Angela, I'm thinking about, like, when you're thinking about policies that are healing, how do we recognize the work that is already taking place? Like we talked about community and our families, and there's so much happening in our own communities. Like, community health workers have been doing this informally, like right without the recognition of the name, and supporting families, like, our own tias and abuelita, they're community health workers in our own families, right? And then also, I'm reminded of our youth, right? Like you talked about, youth informally do peer-to-peer work all the time. They're supporting each other all the time. So why not give them additional resources to really be successful and continue to do that for others, right? Beyond their immediate circles, so that it's just a model that it works. So why not recognize it? Because it's already happening. So let's invest and use the resources that we have to, build more capacity and really make sure that our society is healthy and thriving. Because if our society is healthy and thriving, well, guess what? It benefits all. But that's my own soapbox, I think. But yeah, to your point, it's like, how do we heal, knowing that we are doing some things to heal already?
Yeah. For me, I think, Angela, when you said, creating policies that are based in healing, right? I think where our systems is lacking or falling behind is the fact that the people making the policy maybe have never even, stepped foot into a, youth shelter, or have never actually even met a person with, a mental health diagnosis and their struggle in their lives. And so we really have to advocate for the policymakers to take information from the people doing the work on the ground, not the CEOs of a company, not, the director of behavioral health who's never actually worked a day with a client, So those are the things that I think are lacking in this system, because we all come from working with community and residents and clients. And I think because we have that experience, we all have we're echoing the same message. So I can imagine how many other people have worked in the field who feel the same way. Right? It's almost exhausting to be a mental health worker, knowing that it's like a continuous cycle. And just like you said, you're going to help one child today, but for that one child, you're going to get 10 more coming out of the system with the same issues or even worse. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think also, Edith, to your point about there's a lack of awareness in the lived experience, there's also this certain bias to what things are and are not. Right. So when we think about what does my daughter was telling me, she was having a conversation with her peers around addiction, and they were talking about someone, a friend was saying, well, this person in my life is, drinks a lot. And they were like, really? I would never have thought that, of this person. And they had a conversation around, well, addiction and addicts don't look like what you think, right? Like what is painted on TV. They are functioning day-to-day people. They are parents. They are, your aunt, your uncle, your cousin, your brother, sister. They are just like you and me. And so this perception of like, what does someone who has substance use disorder look like? What does someone with depression look like? What does someone who's has anxiety look like? It looks like you and me, right? So like, let's talk about those things too, and dismantle all these misperceptions and the bias that exists around this topic, because that's part of what's informing the policy too, right? Like, oh, these are, people who are unhoused. Those are the people, that suffer them. Well, yes. And there's also your neighbor, right? So like, how do we put those two people in the same policy? How do we make space for both, and, because that is what exists and is real.
Right. No, you're right.
Okay, so we talked a lot about the importance of family well-being in the context of looking after the well-being and mental health of our own children. And so I was hoping that we can all just share one tip that has helped us with managing burnout as a parent or a caregiver or even a family member. Because I sometimes even have my cousins ask me, like, why is grandpa the way that he is? And grandpa is my uncle. And so it's also like navigating these community conversations about well-being really within our own families too. And sometimes we do need to take a moment to like also breathe from that work, because it's hard work that we're doing, healing ourselves and healing our communities at all ages, but especially our young ones. So what is a tip that you have for managing your own well-being and or burnout?
Yeah, so it's taken me a while to get to this place, but just recognizing that it's okay to not be okay. And it sounds cliche, but really, how many times do people ask you, like, how are you doing? Oh, I'm okay. And I've even stopped friends and family and have said, like, no, but really, how are you? Because it's such like a standard response. And so even opening it up to like, actually, you know what? No, I'm not okay. And I have responded in that way too, where I'm like, oh, I'm fine. I'm okay. And then I'll pause and say, you know what? Actually, no, I'm not. This is on my mind. Right. And just honoring that space for myself and then also for others, I think just changes the narrative. It just creates space for the in between that we are all living in, right? Like, yes, we have those moments where it's like, yes, I can push through and it's fine. But sometimes we just need those 5 minutes of like, no, I just need 5 minutes and I'm not. So, and I'm going to take them. So just honoring that space and just recognizing that I'm not always okay and allowing myself to do that has been and is important. And I'm not perfect. Sometimes I forget, but I try to honor that for myself and for others.
Okay. So for me, personally, there's two things that I do in my family. One, personally, I have tried my best to get off of like the news networks, just like, after 2020, I just feel like the world is on fire. And I try, and even though, sometimes I understand it's our job to keep ourselves informed. But I avoid it when I realize that it's keeping me up at night. It's making me question what world my kids are going to live in the next, because I know that's affecting me subconsciously and I'm going to bed with those thoughts and I don't want that for myself, right? So I do have to stop myself sometimes and just say, you know what, like, I'm going to shut down the TV. I don't want to hear about it. I try not to engage in conversations that have anything to do that, like with, like recently the war is terrible, but I don't have the capacity right now for it, right? So I try to give myself that space. And the other thing that I do with my family is we all have things, like you said, we're always busy. There's days when we have bad days. So I really try to tell my kids and even my husband is, when you're having a bad day and you had a rough day, like it's okay to go lock yourself in the room and say, I need a moment. Today is not the day, Mom. And I tell my kids too, I'll be, today, Mommy had a rough day. I need some time alone. Like I need to go watch some funny TikTok videos and just get this out of my system. And then I'll come back and we'll be fine. So I really push that in my family because I feel like that also allows my kids to say, today was a tough day, Mom, for whatever reason. And then at some point I can talk to them about that and say, well, are you feeling better? Do you want to chat about it? And then we'll talk about it versus it's like they're in a cranky mood. And, as a parent, just like, I've had enough, and nobody talks to each other the rest of the day. And so I really try to set the tone for my kids and myself to say it's okay. Like you said, it's okay to not be okay that day, and take some time for yourself and lock yourself in the room and do whatever makes you happy in that moment. So that's how I take care of myself.
I love that. That's definitely this idea of like you can't pour from an empty cup is definitely at the core of my self-care and self-healing work for sure. And I will say that I probably, especially in the last few years, have had some tough lessons about asking for help. So I am newly disabled with long COVID. I got sick in 2020. And, it made me really realize how much I needed to ask for help, big and small things. And I think I think the idea of asking for help when I was an able-bodied person was just not. It was not in my vocabulary. I'm resilient. I'm independent. I'm gritty. I do all the things, and I like push through. And I think like being really cognizant of my limitations actually really helps me have a lot more compassion for myself, patience with myself, and helps me realize like how much better my life is when I am in community. I think part of being in community is being safe and vulnerable and being able to ask for help when you need it. And I am building that muscle lately, and it feels really good to feel more connected to the people in my life in that way.
I definitely wanted to also say that like reaching out for help piece is also a big piece for me. What I'd like to share is recognizing signs of burnout in your body, what that feels like, a tense jaw, your neck, the base of your neck hurting, your shoulders feeling like it's tough to move, or even migraines, or even just headaches. These are all signs of burnout. And one thing that I like to do is just get my body moving, and that looks different for me every day. That could look like going to the gym. Other days, it literally looks like walking outside of my house, a few steps back and forth. And so it's also, for me, I will just say, do what works for you in that moment. And right now, I'd like to invite our listeners to direct message us on Instagram at A Flourishing Podcast and share with us, what do family members need to help them recognize signs of burnout? And that's the wrap. Thank you, Eva, Edith, and Angela, for joining me today. And I look forward to being in community with you all in the future. Thank you for joining us today on our podcast. This podcast is brought to you by the National Center for Youth Law. To suggest a podcast topic or to express interest in being a podcast guest, please email health@youthlaw.org.